My parents stood behind my sister as she threw me out on Christmas Eve. I stayed silent for a reason. They thought silence meant weakness. I didn't argue. I waited for the documents to speak. The first carol started just as I stepped into the lobby. It drifted down from the stairwell speakers, something cheerful and rehearsed while the building smelled of pine cleaner and burnt coffee from the management office. Christmas Eve had a way of disguising tension as tradition. People smiled more carefully. Voices softened, even when intentions didn't. The lobby was crowded. Tenants stood in small clusters with paper cups and wrapped boxes, waiting for the annual holiday check-in my parents insisted on hosting every year. It was never a party. It was an inspection dressed up as generosity. I looked for my parents first. They were near the notice board. My mother adjusting the garland that hung too low, my father nodding at something my sister was saying. She stood between them, centered, confident, holding a clipboard like it belonged there. I slowed my steps. No one greeted me. Not immediately. That was the first detail I noticed. I had arrived early. I always did. Out of habit, more than expectation. I took off my gloves, folded them neatly, and waited for anyone to acknowledge my presence. My sister finally looked up. "Oh," she said, not smiling. "You're here." There was no accusation in her tone. No warmth either. Just confirmation. "I am," I replied. She glanced at the clipboard again. "We'll talk in a minute." A minute stretched. The tenants began to quiet as my sister stepped forward. She tapped the clipboard lightly, not to demand attention but to signal authority. People responded. They always do when confidence is presented as entitlement. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We'll keep this brief, since it's Christmas Eve." My parents stood beside her, close enough to be included, far enough to avoid responsibility. My mother's eyes avoided mine. My father watched the floor. My sister spoke about holiday maintenance schedules, emergency numbers, the usual. Then she paused. "There is one more matter," she said, and looked directly at me. The pause was deliberate, practiced. "We've had an internal review," she continued, "and it's come to our attention that one of the units is no longer in compliance with its lease terms." The room shifted slightly. Curiosity replaced cheer. She turned fully toward me now. "So we'll need you to vacate the apartment by the end of tonight." There it was. Not a private conversation. Not a warning. Not even a courtesy aside. An announcement. I felt several eyes turn in my direction. Some with sympathy. Some with interest. A few with something closer to relief that it wasn't them. I did not move. "I'm sorry," I said calmly. "I wasn't aware of any violation." She smiled then. A small one, controlled. "You wouldn't be," she said. "You've been accommodated for a long time." The word landed poorly. Accommodated, as if I had been tolerated rather than permitted. My mother cleared her throat, a quiet sound meant to signal discomfort without intervention. My father said nothing. "What terms?" I asked. My sister flipped a page on the clipboard. "Subletting concerns. Administrative inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic. But the decision has been made." "By whom?" She didn't say. I looked at my parents. My mother's hands were clasped tightly in front of her. My father adjusted his coat, as if preparing to leave. No one corrected her. No one said my name. A tenant near the elevators shifted his weight and avoided my eyes. Someone else whispered, then stopped when my sister glanced their way. "This is Christmas Eve," I said, not as an argument. Just a statement. "Yes," my sister replied. "Which is why we're being efficient." Efficient. Another word that sounded reasonable, until you placed it beside a suitcase. She stepped back, signaling the end of discussion. "You can pick up the formal notice from the office," she added. "Keys returned by midnight." Midnight. As if timing could be wrapped neatly, like a gift. I nodded once. There was nothing else to do in that moment. No raised voices would have helped. No explanation would have been heard. I walked toward the elevators, aware of every step, every sound my shoes made against the tile. The carol ended. Silence filled the space it left behind. In the elevator, I noticed a small detail that stayed with me longer than the words. The button for my floor had a faint crack running through it. I had reported it months ago. Maintenance never fixed it. Not important enough. I reached my apartment and unlocked the door. The space looked exactly as it had that morning. Coat on the chair. Mug by the sink. A string of lights half working along the window. I stood there without moving, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration from other units. Laughter. Music. Dishes clinking. I didn't pack right away. Instead, I sat at the small table near the window and watched snow begin to fall. Light. Indecisive. The kind that looks harmless until it accumulates. My phone buzzed. A message from my sister. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I set the phone face down. Then another message. This one from my mother. We'll talk later. Let's not upset everyone tonight. Not upset everyone. I finally stood and began to pack. Not because I believed I had to, but because the act itself clarified things. Each item I placed into a box reminded me how long I had lived quietly. How often I had chosen convenience over certainty. When I reached the bottom drawer of my desk, I paused. Inside was a folder, thin, unmarked. The kind people overlook because it doesn't demand attention. I hadn't opened it in years. I did now. The document inside was dated well before my sister ever held a clipboard. Signed. Filed. Boring in the way only real authority is boring. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back where it belonged. Outside, someone laughed too loudly. The sound echoed down the hallway. I finished packing enough to leave without rush. I carried my bags past the lobby without stopping. My sister wasn't there anymore. Neither were my parents. The garland still hung crooked on the notice board. As I stepped into the cold, I realized something with unexpected calm. This hadn't been about eviction. It had been about certainty, who was supposed to have it, and who wasn't. And that, I understood clearly now, could be corrected. I spent Christmas night in a hotel 2 blocks away. It wasn't the distance that mattered. It was the direction. Away from the building I had lived in quietly for years. Away from the lobby where my sister had spoken with authority that didn't belong to her. Away from my parents' silence, which had felt heavier than her words. The room was clean and anonymous. White walls, neutral art. A single chair near the window. I placed my bag down carefully, as if noise might invite judgment. Then I sat and did nothing for a long time. My phone stayed face down on the desk. By morning, it had filled with messages. My sister's came first. Direct. Managerial. You embarrassed us last night. This didn't need to be public. You should have spoken to us privately. I read them without reacting. Public, apparently, was only a problem when control slipped. My mother's messages followed. Softer, more careful. We're worried about you. Your sister is under a lot of stress. You know how she gets when she's trying to protect the family. Protect, that word again. Always used when exclusion needed. A softer face. My father didn't message at all. That absence said more than anything else. I showered, dressed, and went downstairs for coffee. The lobby was quiet. A couple sat near the window, sharing pastries. No one knew who I was. No one needed me to be anything. That anonymity steadied me. As I walked back toward the building later that morning, I didn't go inside. I stood across the street instead and watched tenants come and go. A maintenance truck pulled up. Someone carried a small Christmas tree toward the curb. Life continued without ceremony. That was when the calls began. My sister tried again, this time insisting we clear the air. When I didn't answer, she escalated. Accusations replaced explanations. She said I had taken advantage of my parents for years. That I had lived cheaply out of obligation. That my presence had always been temporary, even if I hadn't realized it. Temporary. Another word, chosen carefully. By afternoon, extended family joined in. An aunt asked why I couldn't just apologize and move on. A cousin suggested I had misunderstood the situation. Someone else reminded me how much my parents had done for me. No one asked where I was sleeping. That night, I returned to the hotel and opened the folder again. The document inside was unremarkable. Typed, signed, filed with the city years ago. It named me as the owner of the building quietly transferred during a refinancing process my father had asked me to manage when his health began to fail. At the time, it had seemed procedural. A way to streamline things. He had trusted me with numbers, with forms, with details my sister dismissed as tedious. He had never announced it. He had never needed to. I hadn't thought about the document in years, because nothing had required it. Ownership, when undisputed, is invisible. Now it wasn't. The next morning, I received a formal email from my sister. Attached was a notice of eviction. Poorly drafted. Incorrect dates. No reference number. Confident. Not careful. I forwarded it to a lawyer I had worked with before. Not my parents' lawyer. Mine. He called me an hour later. This is invalid, he said simply. And she has no authority to issue it. I looked out the window at the street below. What would you advise? Nothing, he replied. Not yet. That answer fit the rhythm I had settled into. The pressure continued. My sister told people I was being difficult. That I was refusing to cooperate. That I was trying to ruin Christmas. My parents repeated those phrases without questioning them. They didn't know the full story. Or perhaps they didn't want to. In quiet moments, memories surfaced, not dramatic ones, but transactional truths. I remembered covering a mortgage payment when my parents were short one winter, managing the building's tax reassessment appeal when my sister said she was too busy, sitting with contractors, reviewing bids, making sure repairs stayed within budget. I had never been thanked for those things. They were framed as responsibilities rather than contributions. I had accepted that framing because it kept things simple. But simplicity has a cost when it hides imbalance. On the third day after Christmas, my sister requested a meeting. Neutral ground, coffee shop. Public eye agreed. She arrived early, already seated, laptop open. She didn't order anything until I sat down. "This has gone too far," she said, without greeting. "We need to fix it." I nodded. "How do you suggest we do that?" She leaned forward. "You leave quietly. We'll help you find another place. Dad doesn't need this stress." There it was. The appeal to protection again. The assumption that stress flowed only one way. "I've already left," I said. Quietly, she frowned. "Then why are you involving lawyers?" "I haven't," I replied. "You have." That unsettled her. Not because it contradicted her plan, but because it introduced uncertainty. "You're being unreasonable," she said. "You've always done this, pretended not to understand how things work." I watched her carefully then. The way she spoke about work without ever naming it. Authority without source. Confidence without record. "I understand how things work," I said. "That's why I'm listening." She stared at me, waiting for more. There was none. When the meeting ended, she looked frustrated, not angry. Frustration comes from not knowing where to apply pressure. That evening, my lawyer sent me a summary. Clear, concise, prepared, ownership confirmed, transfer documented. No legal obligation to vacate. Significant liability on the other side if they continued. I didn't feel vindicated reading it. Just calm. The next step would not be dramatic. It would be procedural. A board meeting was scheduled for early January. My sister planned to present new management guidelines. Tenants would attend. My parents would be there. An investor I had never met would be present. So would my lawyer. I didn't announce that. I simply confirmed attendance. On the night before the meeting, my mother called again. "You're tearing the family apart," she said softly. I closed my eyes. Not in pain. In recognition. "No," I replied. "I'm letting it be accurate." She didn't respond. After the call ended, I packed one last box from the hotel room. Not because I needed to move, but because the act of preparation felt right. Tomorrow would not involve raised voices. It would involve records. And records, once opened, do not take sides. They simply tell the truth to anyone willing to look. The second public gathering after my father's funeral wasn't planned as one. It formed the way storms do: slow pressure, a shift in air, people arriving without being summoned. The lawyer requested a reading of the will at his office, and my mother insisted it be moved to the community hall attached to the mosque. She said the house felt heavy. She said people would talk anyway. She said transparency would protect us. I agreed. Silence had already taught me its uses. The hall smelled faintly of dust and rosewater. Plastic chairs were set in uneven rows. My sister arrived early and chose a seat near the front, angled slightly so people could see her face. My mother sat beside her. My uncles took the first row. Cousins filled the back, whispering with the impatience of an audience that believed it knew the ending. I took a seat near the aisle, not close enough to be counted, not far enough to be dismissed. I folded my hands and waited. The lawyer arrived with a slim folder and a heavier briefcase. He greeted my mother, nodded at my sister, and acknowledged me with the same neutral courtesy he had used for months. No familiarity, no reassurance, just professionalism. It steadied me. He didn't begin with speeches. He didn't apologize for the circumstances. He opened the folder and read my father's name, full and exact, as it appeared on his documents. Hearing it aloud pressed something tight behind my ribs. The first pages were ordinary. Assets listed, accounts named, dates confirmed. The hall breathed together, then grew restless. People shifted. My sister crossed one leg over the other and smiled at someone I couldn't see. Then the lawyer paused. He adjusted his glasses and looked up, not at my mother, not at my sister, but at the room. Before distribution, he said, "There is a declaration." A quiet settled, different from the funeral quiet. This one waited. He read my father's words without embellishment. A paragraph written in his measured hand, transcribed exactly as filed. It stated the names of his children, plural. It named me. It described my birth as recorded, my adoption as false, The rumor as a convenience created years ago to protect other truths he did not wish to air publicly. My sister laughed once. It was short and sharp, like something breaking. "That's not possible," she said. It was the only time she spoke without being invited. The lawyer did not look at her. He continued. He read the clause that followed. It outlined authority who could make decisions about the properties, the business interests, the trust established 15 years earlier. My father had named an executor, not my mother, not my sister, me. The word sat in the air. Executor. It carried weight without drama. My mother's hands tightened around her purse. She did not interrupt. She did not defend. She stared at the floor, as if the tiles had betrayed her. The lawyer reached into the briefcase and removed a second folder. "There are exhibits," he said. He placed copies on the table at the front. Birth records. A notarized affidavit from the midwife who had delivered me. Bank documents showing signatures I recognized as my father's. Authorizing me years earlier to act in limited capacities I had never exercised publicly. I felt eyes move toward me. Not all at once. In stages. Curiosity first, then recalculation. My sister stood. "This is manipulation," she said, louder now. "He planned this to embarrass us." The lawyer finally looked at her. "These documents were filed years ago," he said. "Nothing here was created for today." A man from the back raised a hand. A distant cousin, an accountant by trade. "What about the house?" he asked. "Who owns the house?" The lawyer turned a page. "The house," he said, "is held by the trust. The trust's beneficiary is—" He stopped, corrected himself. "The trust's beneficiaries are listed here. Primary authority rests with the executor." He did not say my name again. He did not need to. My sister sat down. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound echoed longer than it should have. The lawyer continued with the distributions. Portions set aside for my mother. Provisions for my sister that were generous but conditional. Clear language. Specific expectations. Consequences for interference. When he finished, he closed the folder and asked if there were questions. No one spoke. A representative from the bank had been invited at my request. He stood when prompted and confirmed the accounts. His presence wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. He explained access protocols and timelines. He addressed me directly when necessary, using my full name. Each time he did, the room adjusted again. The meeting ended without applause or outrage. People left in clusters. Conversations muted. Glances careful. My sister remained seated, her posture rigid, as if standing would require a decision she wasn't ready to make. My mother approached me last. Her face was composed, practiced. "You should have told us," she said. "I didn't know it was my place," I replied. It was the closest we came to an argument. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded without ceremony. Notices were sent. Locks were changed by professionals, not relatives. Meetings were scheduled with advisors who spoke in timelines and compliance. I signed papers in rooms that smelled of coffee and toner. My sister called once. Her voice was careful, controlled. She spoke about misunderstandings, about family, about how public things didn't have to become permanent. I listened. I did not promise anything. When I hung up, I felt lighter. Not relieved. Clear. At the next community gathering, people greeted me differently. Not warmly. Not coldly. Accurately. They asked procedural questions. They asked for updates. They asked permission. I answered what was appropriate. I deferred what was not. I learned the difference between being seen and being useful. Months later, I visited my father's grave alone. The stone was clean. The name was correct. I stood there longer than I intended, not waiting for anything to happen, just allowing the quiet to exist without resistance. I did not win anything that day in the hall. I received what had been placed carefully, deliberately, into the future. My father had chosen ink over noise, documents over defenses, time over arguments. I understood him then. Justice didn't arrive as a moment. It settled as a condition. It rearranged rooms and relationships. It asked nothing from me except steadiness. When I left the cemetery, I didn't look back. Not because there was nothing there, but because, finally, there was nothing chasing me forward. Power does not announce itself when it finally settles. It rearranges small things first. The first change was practical. Letters arrived addressed to me, not forwarded, not copied. Banks asked for confirmations. Lawyers asked for schedules. Contractors waited for approvals that once moved through my sister's voice. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. Systems simply adjusted to the correct center. My sister noticed before anyone else. She came to my office one afternoon without calling ahead. The receptionist hesitated, then buzzed me. I told her to let my sister in. She walked slower than she used to. Not weak, careful. Her confidence had learned to look for permission, even when it pretended not to. She stood instead of sitting, as if chairs had become temporary things. "You've changed the locks," she said. "I followed the security review," I replied. "It was recommended." She nodded, absorbing the language. "Procedures were harder to fight than people." "You didn't have to do it like this," she said after a pause. "I didn't do anything," I answered. "The structure did." That irritated her more than anger would have. She preferred opponents. Systems didn't care about her tone. She asked about allowances, about timelines, about whether the house could be sold. I answered each question evenly, referencing clauses, dates, obligations. I didn't remind her of the funeral. I didn't mention what she had said. It wasn't necessary. The present carried enough weight. When she left, she thanked me. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from her mouth. My mother adjusted more quietly. She stopped calling every evening. She started asking before making plans. The house felt different when I visited, not colder, just less certain of itself. Photographs remained on the walls, but their meanings had shifted. I noticed which frames had been dusted recently and which hadn't. She never apologized. I didn't expect her to. Silence had always been her language of choice. I had simply learned to translate it accurately. At community events, people approached me with a kind of politeness reserved for authority that doesn't perform. They asked careful questions. They waited for answers. No one brought up the funeral directly. Public humiliation has a way of erasing itself once it fails. I became known as the son who handles things. Not the favorite, not the problem, the one who signs. That role fit more comfortably than I expected. There were moments, though, when the past tried to speak. An uncle suggested a redistribution for harmony. A cousin hinted that my sister had suffered enough. I listened, thanked them for their concern, and asked them to put any requests in writing. None of them did. Paper has a way of ending conversations before they begin. Late one evening, I found a box among my father's stored belongings. It wasn't labeled. Inside were notebooks, sold thin ones, filled with his handwriting. They weren't confessions or secrets. They were plans. Notes about risks he'd taken. Mistakes he'd corrected quietly. People he'd trusted too early. Between the pages, I found a single envelope with my name on it. Inside was a letter. Short, direct. He wrote that he had seen how the family leaned. He wrote that loud people often mistake volume for permanence. He said he wanted me protected not by his voice, but by his absence, by structures that could not be argued with. He ended with one line: "If they ever make you small in public, remember, I already made you permanent in private." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back. I did not reread it often. I didn't need to. Months passed. The business stabilized. Decisions became routine. Authority, I learned, becomes boring when it is used correctly. That bored me in a good way. My sister tried once more to reclaim ground, this time socially. She hosted a dinner, invited extended family, framed it as reconciliation. I attended. I arrived on time. I brought a modest gift. She made a speech about unity, about misunderstanding, about how grief changes people. She did not mention names. She did not look at me. When dessert was served, an aunt asked about a property sale rumor. I clarified calmly. I explained the timeline. I referenced approvals. The room adjusted again. After dinner, my sister stood beside me in the hallway. "You don't need to keep proving it," she said. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm just answering questions." She watched me for a long moment, as if searching for the version of me she could dismiss. She didn't find it. Loss doesn't always hurt where you expect. Sometimes it hurts when you realize something will never return, because it was taken, but because it was never real. What I lost was not a sister. It was the illusion that fairness would come from affection. What I gained was clarity. The final adjustment came quietly. The trust required a public filing at the end of the fiscal year. Names listed. Roles confirmed. Nothing sensational, but official. When the notice appeared, people stopped whispering entirely. Official records tend to end speculation more effectively than arguments. I stood outside the courthouse afterward, the paper folded in my pocket. The city moved around me, indifferent. Cars passed. Vendors argued over change. Life continued without commentary. I realized then that revenge had never interested me. Exposure had never been the goal. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was to stand without being erased. My sister's words at the funeral had tried to make me temporary. The response had made me permanent. That was enough. I went home that evening to a quiet apartment. I cooked dinner for myself. I ate slowly. I slept without interruption. Power did not feel triumphant. It felt settled. And for the first time, the silence around me wasn't dangerous at all. It was earned. Closure does not arrive as a moment. It settles like dust after movement stops. Months after everything had realigned, I found myself standing alone in the building on a Sunday morning. No staff, no meetings, just the quiet hum of systems doing what they were designed to do. Elevators resting, lights on timers, security cameras blinking patiently. I walked the floors the way my father used to, slow, observational, hands behind his back. He never rushed through places he owned. He believed ownership required presence, not noise. I stopped in front of the window overlooking the street where my parents once held my hand as a child. The world below looked smaller now, not because it had changed, but because I had finally stepped outside of it. I thought about Christmas Eve eviction, the certainty in my sister's voice, the way my parents stood behind her without standing beside me. I remembered how calm I had felt, even then, not because I was strong, but because something inside me had already let go. People assume justice must feel loud to feel real. They're wrong. Justice feels like routine. My parents moved into a smaller place shortly after. Not out of punishment, out of necessity. Their lifestyle had been built on assumptions, and assumptions do not survive paperwork. I helped them with the transition. I hired movers. I arranged utilities. My mother thanked me once, quietly, while watching the movers carry boxes out. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," I replied. That was the entire conversation. She never asked why I hadn't fought harder that night. She never asked how I'd known. Some questions auntie asked because people already know the answers. Dante want to say them aloud. My sister disappeared for a while. Changed circles. Changed tone. When she eventually resurfaced, it was careful. She had learned that public confidence without private ground is a temporary performance. We crossed paths at a charity event months later. She nodded at me. I nodded back. Nothing more. It wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. There's a difference. What surprised me most wasn't their silence, it was my own peace. I had expected some emotional reckoning, some delayed anger, some need to explain myself to people who had never listened. None of it came. Instead, I felt finished, not empty. Finished. I began spending less time managing and more time building. New projects, new partnerships. People who didn't know my family history and didn't need to. With them, I wasn't the quiet son or the overlooked brother. I was simply competent. That simplicity was freeing. One evening, while organizing old files, I found a recording my father had made years ago, a voice memo unlabeled. I pressed play. His voice was older, slower. He talked about legacy, not money, not buildings, but pressure. He said families reveal themselves when power shifts. He said the person who survives that shift without becoming cruel is the one who truly inherits something. He paused in the recording, then said, almost casually, "Silence is a test. Most people fail it." I turned the recording off and sat there for a long time. I understood then that the story had never been about eviction, or ownership, or public humiliation. Those were just the visible moments. The real story was about restraint, about knowing when not to speak, not to defend, not to beg for space at tables that were never meant to hold you. The world teaches people to demand. My father taught me to wait. That lesson cost me a family illusion, but it gave me a future that didn't require permission. Occasionally, I still receive messages from people who witnessed that Christmas Eve. They apologize. They say they didn't know. They say they would have spoken up if they had. I thank them politely. I don't explain that speaking up wouldn't have changed anything. Structures don't respond to sympathy. They respond to truth, placed carefully, and allowed to do its work. On the anniversary of my father's death, I visited his grave alone. No ceremony. No speeches. I stood there and told him, quietly, that everything was stable. I didn't say I was happy. I said I was steady. That mattered more. As I walked away, I realized something else. Something subtle but important. Stories like mine don't end. They settle. And then they watch. They watch how you handle the next slight, the next exclusion, the next quiet betrayal disguised as family. Because those moments always return in different forms. The difference is that once you've survived one without breaking, you recognize the pattern instantly. You stop fearing it. And fearlessness seals silent. I don't know who will hear this story next. Someone sitting quietly in a room where they're tolerated, not respected. Someone being erased politely. Someone being tested by silence they didn't choose. If that's you, Remember this. You don't need to correct a lie immediately. You don't need to defend your worth publicly. You don't need to shout to survive humiliation. Sometimes, the strongest response is preparation. And sometimes, the ending everyone waits for is simply watching the truth arrive without you lifting a finger. I learned that the night I was evicted. I confirmed it the day the documents spoke for me, and I live it now comfortably, quietly, permanently. The story doesn't end with revenge, it ends with clarity. And clarity, once earned, never leaves. Because the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone who has already learned how to stay silent.